Hello, welcome back. The Spirit of Joy's devotional series called Who Killed Jesus? Let's do a little quick review. I can imagine Pilate's disappointment. In passing the buck to Herod, he had hoped he would take care of the matter with this Jesus. But it was not to be. So Pilate tries a second time to put this trial to rest. Far from his mind was to put Jesus to death. Now that Jesus is back, Pilate tries a new strategy. Besides calling the chief priests Caiaphas and the Pharisees, Pontius Pilate also calls the people. Remember, we read that last time. He lets the crowd of commoners come in, and among them many who supported Jesus. So Pilate is hoping that these people would continue to support Jesus. To make sure, he tells them that he will have Jesus flogged, and then he'll release him. And again, he directs his word to the religious leaders, I find no fault in this man. But it seems mob psychology had taken over. The vehement hatred lashed out against Jesus by the religious leaders seemed to affect the crowd. And they got all caught up in the yelling and screaming, and it ended up losing their heads. And remember, that's the minute when they yelled for a criminal to be released and to crucify Jesus in his place. Remember, Pontius Pilate said it was something they did every Passover. They would release one criminal, give him a second chance. So Pontius Pilate thought, I'm going to say, okay, do you want Barabbas, this murderer, this rebellious leader against the government? Should we release him, or shall we release Jesus? The crowd did lose its head. And they said, we want you to release Barabbas. I wonder if this criminal Barabbas heard all this yelling. I'm not sure where he was at that time, where the prison was. I wonder if he heard his name yelled out, release Barabbas! We'll never know. But Barabbas had been arrested for rebelling against the Roman authority and for the murder of a Roman soldier. According to history books, he was most likely a leader of the Jewish militants who wanted to overthrow the Roman government by force. And he was good at it. He lived in the hills and had planned many a revolt. But that's all the history books know about him, and the scriptures never mention his name again. After the people yelled, release Barabbas and crucify Jesus. Anything beyond that time is mere speculation about who Barabbas was, or how he lived out the rest of his life. But why not speculate a bit? Why not ponder upon what happened to Barabbas after he was released? Did he see Jesus crucified? Did he know about the resurrection of Jesus? We'll never know. But then the question is for us today, And I just lost my place, but let me get back to that. We'll never know whether Barabbas witnessed the crucifixion or heard about Jesus' resurrection. But several years ago, I was given a book. Its title was simply Barabbas. It was written by Per Langervist, the son of Swedish peasants who was born in 1891. He early rebelled against his Orthodox conservative background, and he called himself a believer without faith, a religious atheist. He was the author of over 35 books, and his publication of Barabbas and the award of the Nobel Peace Prize for Literature in 1951 finally brought him to international fame as one of the most insightful interpreters of contemporary consciousness. He wrote about Barabbas because he too wondered what was the kind of conscience that Barabbas lived with the rest of his life. And even though it is a historical novel, which means most of it is mere speculation, it brought Barabbas to life for me. The book wonders with us what kind of life he led after he was released instead of Jesus. In this novel, God's grace did not forsake Barabbas. But Barabbas couldn't get this Jesus out of his mind. Jesus took his place. Oh, he wanted to many times. Then at other times he so wanted to believe the words he heard about this Jesus being raised from the dead and that he was the Son of God, whose message was simply, love one another as I have loved you. But his logical mind and the brutal world he lived in wouldn't let him. So although Per Langervist wrote his book out of mere speculation, he wrote with a convincing conclusion. You and I are like Barabbas. And God won't let go of us either. Why? Because of God's grace. God's grace lights up the darkest corners of people's lives. It shines brightly when all hope is lost. God's grace never lets us down, no matter what we have done or not have done. We let ourselves down when we don't accept God's grace. And I think this author, Per Langervist, who called himself a religious atheist, he too was searching. How do you get rid of some of these heavy burdens and some of these regrets? And how come me and not someone else? Why, like Barabbas, do we find it so difficult to accept God's grace at those very times in our lives when it would make us free? Brand new creatures in the bright light of God's grace. The author said it's simply because we are human. And being human has its bent toward trying to prove ourselves, trying to put ourselves in the best light. But this is all self-deception. And don't we as Christians every Sunday morning say to each other out loud, we confess that we are in bondage to sin and cannot free ourselves. Now, true, we are not like criminals like Barabbas, but we are nevertheless in the same kind of bondage. Human bondage, says Par Langravist. And the more we live in human bondage, we question our very own identities and live our lives as if our worth depended on what other people think of us. In this Barabbas novel, Barabbas never dared tell anyone that he was the criminal who was released instead of Jesus. And yet he knew there was whispering all around him that he was the guilty one. And he never could rid himself of those whispers. His conscience always reminded him of those whispers, that he was the one who should have died. Oh, what a terrible way to live. Might this historical novel of Barabbas remind us that we needn't live like Barabbas did, or like the author said he did. Why? Because God's grace and forgiveness is new to us each day for us to accept. We need to only set aside our pride and our regrets and our human logic. Oh, how many of our regrets we could let go of. May God grant that we might do so as we accept the grace and forgiveness of the God we claim to worship. And by the way, do you know of a Barabbas? Someone who can't seem to feel forgiven? If so, why not take a chance and talk to him about the God you know, the God of grace and forgiveness? Now, next week is our last week. Now, our next session, our next devotion is the last one. And we will be talking about Judas Iscariot, the disciple of Jesus, who betrayed him in the garden and who never, ever could forgive himself for that betrayal. Until next time, see you again. Bye-bye.